My household needs your prayers for a good reason. Well, my wife and I do. My daughter, I think I mentioned, and my granddaughter and her dad. They come as a unit, but for me, it's the granddaughter. Have moved back to Richmond, and I forget the original schedule, but the movers showed up at their New York house 2 days early. Yeah, well, no, I didn't, because we were unprepared to have them. They're going to be with us for at least a week while the mover gets here now with their household, and they move into the new house with it. And they don't want to try to move in furniture and things with their 19-month-old helping them. So they're staying at our house until they get moved in and arrive 2 days early. And so she's been at our house for, 4 days. I'm tired. I will tell you what, I don't remember it being that way, but I was younger and more energetic, and so this morning I'm like, dragging a little bit. All right, I want to read a sentence from a paragraph I finished with last week so that we don't start in medias res here. We're talking about, we've turned our attention to what the Bible might have to say about government and politics living together. And I quoted from, with respect to the notion that we're created in the image of God having political implication. I quoted Wesleyan theologian Theodore Weber, who puts it this way. The image of God concept grounds government theologically in the doctrine of God, or more specifically, in the governing relationship of God to the world. Government as disclosed in human nature as political image is what God does in ordering, preserving, and developing the creation. And he goes on to suggest that if we emulate God, we will govern the way God created. Follow me? Okay. Now, picking up with where we should be today. The biblical account of the creation of humankind in the image of God also establishes the fundamental power structure of human interrelationships. Male and female alike bear the image of God. Human interrelationship is therefore non-hierarchical. There is no subordination. The continuation of the account complements this portrayal by means of the mandate to exercise dominion. You remember that? Have dominion over them. Okay. Although it should not seem so to Christians familiar with the gospel story, with Jesus saying, contrasting the tyranny of the rulers of the Gentiles with servant greatness in the kingdom. That's in Mark chapter 10. Or with the grand Christological hymn of Philippians 2:6-11. The notion of dominion without hierarchy. Think about that. Dominion, exercising dominion without employing hierarchy may sound almost paradoxical to many, but it shouldn't to us Christians. A final implication of the Imago Dei, an implication developed further in God's blessing, also involves the corporate image of humankind. Not only does this creation suggest something about the complexity of the divine character, but it also, and let me amplify that, if male and female, and this is controversial, these days, if male and female manifest the image of God, that suggests something about God's character, right? The fact that when we call God Father, that's true, but not complete. But it also suggests that the plurality and diversity of humankind are necessary to express the divine will. Pluralism is not to be overcome, but to be embraced as the rich expression of divine diversity. Since I wrote this, I've done some further reading and further thinking. I encountered an article, edited an article, for a journal I used to be the managing editor of. I'm not anymore. It got to be too much work. But anyway, a fellow with a young PhD in systematic theology wrote an article which was inspired by his own daughter, who was, I think, at the time of the writing of the article, maybe 3, maybe 4. And she had some sort of severe, I don't know how to be politically correct these days, limitation mentally. When people talk about, traditionally, theologians talk about what does it mean that we're created in the image of God? What about us reflects God? That's the question. And over the years, it's been suggested that it's our intellect or our reason, our ability to communicate, our ability to be creative, all of these possibilities. And his article was about the fact that his daughter could do none of those things. And yet he rejected the idea that she too was not created in the image of God. In other words, his poor, unfortunate situation with his daughter, she was as much a human being, he suggested, as any of the rest of us are, and therefore it participated in that reflection of God's image as much as any of the rest of us do. You follow me? So he suggested, on the basis of what the biblical text says, let us create humankind is the best way to translate that word, in our image, such that it takes all of humankind, right, to fully reflect who God is. So he argued that, and apparently, and if you've ever known children especially like this, she was extremely loving and open and friendly and, all that kind of stuff. In ways that sometimes those of us who are more, quote, unquote, normal, if I'm the standard of normalcy, I'm sorry for the world. But anyway, those of us who are more or less normal, I have wished many times that we could be as open and warm and loving as, So the idea he developed in his article was that God is so rich and complex, it takes all of us put together to begin to reflect the image of God. Humankind. Since reading that, I think it was a 20-page article, my thinking about this whole subject has been revolutionized. It takes all of that complexity of human. So, and by the way, I don't think that's, you go on to think about the fact that God, well, let's save that for later. Remember that subtopic of the plurality necessary and diversity, yes.
If you take all of mankind, there's evil, there's certain people who are evil and so on.
Well,
how does that fit in?
Yeah, I would suggest that we're not created that way. That's things the Bible goes on to talk about, the fall and all of Adam and Eve's choice. We're not created for that, right? We become that, we decide that, we choose that. So that's not, I just heard a thing on NPR. It's called the veneer theory. It's going to be on the radio today. I think this afternoon I might have to listen to it. And the question is, are people created are we basically good or are we basically bad? The veneer theory says we're basically selfish, and there's this veneer of civility that we've learned in order to get along with. Except the teaser on NPR said, the people they were talking to said, unfortunately, that is not supported by science. The science suggests that we're basically good, and we learn to be wicked. I guess it'd be the right way. An analogy would be, nobody's born a racist. You learn it. There have been studies about that with little children. So that would be my answer to that. Okay. I've just said the thing about rich expression of divine diversity. Immediately after the narration of the creation of humankind, Genesis reports that God blessed human beings with a twofold blessing. Commentators often refer to this blessing as a command or a mandate, overlooking the significance of the fact that God's directive takes the form of a blessing. Indeed, God's primary method of creation, according to Genesis 1, is blessing. English cannot easily convey the logic of the Hebrew jussive verbs, God employs in directing the cosmos to come into existence. Consequently, English translations find it difficult to make evident their proximity to blessing. Biblical blessings are not commands, yet they are more than wishes, especially when found on God's lips. A simple rearrangement of the sentence, "let there be light," into light maybe helps, but still falls short of conveying the Hebrew idea. These divine blessings give permission. They authorize. They empower. Light began to shine in the primordial darkness because God authorized and empowered light to come into existence. Sea creatures came to life because God authorized and empowered the sea to produce them. Let me suggest you read Genesis 1 sometime. And all those let there be's, let me talk about that, the problem with translating that just a little bit. In English, they belong to a category of verbs known as voluntatives. I'm sorry, the Hebrew professor comes out. Expressions of will. And there are three kinds possible. In English, we only have two of them. The kind we're most familiar with are imperatives in the second person. You implied, remember this from school? You implied, shut the door, right? The second kind that we still have in English are what are called the cohortatives. Let's go to town. That's an expression of will in the first person, right? Or let me see what I can do about that, right? How would you express that volition in the third person? Hebrew has it's called a jussive. And it would be something like saying, door, shut yourself. Or door, be shut. Who's doing the shutting? You're addressing the door. Would we do that in English? We'd find that ridiculous, right? To tell the door to get itself shut, right? However you got to do it, door, get yourself, shut yourself. We wouldn't tell it. All those let so-and-so happen in Hebrew are those jussives, in which God says to the light, light, become, light, come into being. So all these arguments, I get tickled about them, about God making things. God doesn't, in Genesis 1, God doesn't make anything. God authorized whatever it is and empowers whatever it is to come into existence. Except later on in the chapter, and this throws those who are anti-science into hissy fits. God did not create the animal and the fish life in the world. God told the sea, produce fish. And so the sea created the fish on God's command, with God's permission, and at God's instruction. Think about that a minute. Same with the land and animals and so on and so forth. So, I'm going to pick up where I left off. In contrast to the divine blessing upon light, the sea and the dry land, the blessing for humanity is in direct address. Thus, the blessing both enables humanity to execute it and also calls humanity to do so in free response to the blessing, rendering humanity responsible to God. The blessing grants humanity the freedom to have a history. It also points to a central component of the biblical portrayal of God's sovereignty. In the Bible, God rarely acts as though by divine fiat. Instead, God authorizes and empowers entities within creation to cooperate with God. God calls upon the sea to produce living creatures and the dry land to produce vegetation. God appoints a sirocco wind to vex Jonah, a kikion plant, we don't know what those are, to shade him from the sun, and then a cutworm to return Jonah to his misery. But with the sea, the wind blows, the kikion plant grows, and the cutworm eats. In all this, God authorizes and empowers components of creation to participate in executing God's will in the world. Again, consideration of the political implications of the biblical account of the creation of humankind returns to the themes of vulnerability, cooperation, and service. The first substantive element of the blessing for humanity authorizes humankind to join animal life in populating the earth. As is true of the Imago Dei, this mandate is not addressed to the individuals, but to corporate humankind. Likewise, as applied in the creation of corporate humankind in God's image, the authorization to fill the earth, Genesis 1:28, anticipates plurality and diversity. In fact, it's fall, so I thought I'd wear it. I did what I did. Yes, I did. I got it. I'll park move for a second. No, I got it. I'll park this right here. And put this back here. All right. Now I can go on without breaking out into a sweat. I'm talking about filling the earth, anticipating plurality and diversity. In fact, a recent trend in the interpretation of the Tower of Babel episode calls attention to the fact that not only did the people on the plains of Shinar foolishly attempt to secure a name for themselves, but they also represented the entire human race at the time, massing together rather than spreading throughout the earth to fill it. Arguably, then, God's decision to confuse their language indicates that God authorized more than a diversity of individual human traits. God blessed humanity in its cultural diversity as well. The world's plurality of cultures pleases God. From a Trinitarian perspective, humankind best images God when it manifests harmony or unity in difference, not uniformity. The second substantive element of the blessing authorized humankind to order human life within certain boundaries. In other words, through the mandate to subdue the world, God left structuring human society to humans. Nay, God enjoined it. There is no divinely ordained sanitation system. It is not a sin to drive on the left side of the road if you live in Britain. God expects such variation. But these differences are what the Lutherans used to call adiaphora, the blue carpet, red carpet argument, right? They don't matter. Byproducts of humans' God-given freedom to order its own affairs as long as their efforts do not produce disorder. Notably in this respect, the fertility motif appears in God's blessing on fish. Whoops. Stuck together. And birds, land animals, however, do not receive such a blessing. The omission avoids the impression that humans and land animals must compete for resources. This omission is consistent with the commission of humanity to exercise dominion over the earth and its animals. The history of the interpretation of this blessing has perverted it into a curse. Norbert Lofink, of blessed memory, has suggested translating kabash, to take possession of, to reflect its etymological origins. Calling attention to usages in numbers, Klaus Koch suggests the translation gestalten, which in German means to configure. So think of the image of subduing the earth. That's a very hierarchical make use of, take advantage of, all that kind of thing. And others have suggested it means rather to take possession of, and I like Koch's idea of it means to configure, to order, to administrate. Similarly, Eric Zinger points to usages of the verb, radah, to denote the activity of a shepherd with a flock. Since, however, any cultural human activity does some violence, and tending flocks may require force to protect weak animals, Magdalene Fretlow suggests that the idea of human dominion, a royal metaphor for creatures in God's image, can be entirely free of violent connotations. Nevertheless, humanity's exercise of dominion is not unrestrained. Genesis 1:29-30 prescribes different foods for the animals and humanity, apparently to prevent competition. More importantly, in God's original intention, humanity was meant to be vegetarian. Read Genesis 1 to 9 very carefully. The permission to consume meat comes after the flood, and then with restrictions. Human beings are to exercise dominion over the world without the shedding of blood. The next section is entitled Redemption, or Reversing the Curse. Of course, the biblical story of humankind hastens to the episode involving the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, narrating how the first pair failed fully to trust God and thereby introduced shame and mistrust into the world. Blessing became curse. Now, because of their selfishness, the intended reciprocity and equality between genders gave way to hierarchy and subordination, even to pain in childbirth. Now, because of their misuse of the garden, their garden will resist efforts to manage it, turning wholesome work into toil. When Dr. James Young Simpson introduced chloroform as an anesthetic for use in childbirth in 1847, many prominent clergy objected that it circumvented the curse imposed upon women after the fall. God wanted women to suffer. Don't mess with that. Many conservative Christians employed the same argument a generation ago with respect to race relations, and others still later to the objectives of feminism and women's rights. As we have recently discussed, many established Christian theologies of government operate largely on the acceptance of the fallen state of humankind as a fundamental given. According to them, government functions primarily to protect the innocent from the encroachment of evildoers, to restrain sinners, to enforce the curse. My question asks whether God raised Jesus Christ from the dead in order to enforce the curse or to lift it, restoring mutuality and reciprocity, ending mistrust and shame. The first 3 chapters of Genesis tell the story of the creation, blessing, and human accursedness. The Bible does not end the story there, however. By Genesis 12, 1-3, God has called Abraham and his descendants to be the avenue for returning the blessing to all the families of the earth. And the biblical story becomes the tale of redemption. With regard to a theology of government, these observations raise the question of whether such a theology should be rooted in the doctrine of creation, the doctrine of sin, or the doctrine of redemption as the restoration of blessing. I joined Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who argued that just government strains toward redemption and that blessing is God's possibility for saving the world, although it requires human mediation. People who bless recognize the difference between what God wills and what actually is. By blessing, they promise that God's will can become, and they contradict those who desire the continuation of the status quo. Blessing aims at redemption. The righteous meet injustice and violence, not with hatred and retribution, but with blessing. They can do so only because they have been blessed. Magdalene Fretler, in her wonderful study of the biblical concept of blessing, observes that, and I quote, "Only where human beings appropriate the dominium terrae, the domination of the earth, as a blessing, that is, when they understand it not as an exercise of their own power, but as a mandate empowered by God, when they respect the boundaries established by God, and as images of God, give structure to God's dominion as human dominion on earth without the shedding of blood and without hierarchy, can they prove to be a blessing to the community of creation, consisting of all living beings." Whew. That's heavy. That's pretty heavy stuff. Oh. When I read this, I think I told you a couple of Sundays ago that I had a college friend who actually did something slightly unethical, but that's okay. She was the assistant for a history professor that I had a course in with, and she saw me on campus one day and she said, I peeked at your paper. And she called me Biddle. She said, Biddle, how you don't talk like you write at all? And I said, no, it's hard to get my mountain accent on a piece of paper. Which I had a bigger one of in those days, I'll have to say. We've come to the conclusion. Aren't you pleased? To conclude, this approach to government also holds potential as a framework for Christian, non-Christian dialogue in the realm of the common good. Since its roots in the creation blessing, place it under the heading of natural revelation or natural law. Protestant theologians in particular tend to undervalue the biblical witness to the utility of the wisdom view of the world. Barth's famous aversion to natural revelation, although understandable in the historical context as a reaction to Nazism's amalgamation of the Darwinian concept of the survival of the fittest, Nietzsche's Übermensch, and the pseudoscience of Arianism, is tantamount to a rejection of Proverbs 8, Romans 1, and in one sense, John 1. Proverbs 8, wisdom personified as Lady Wisdom, talks about how she was present at the creation and how God created everything that is according to her, such that if you look at the world carefully, you can see God's wisdom and how things run. You got that? And that there is a revelation of God in nature available to us all. Romans 1, Paul says, it's been made known to everybody, everywhere, the basic things about an invisible God in the visible things of creation. And humankind has perverted that. John 1, all things that are were made through the Logos, the wisdom, the Word of God, right? So the Bible has a wide witness to the notion that you don't have to be in the Mosaic covenant, you don't have to believe in Jesus. You can know something about how God has ordered things, how God intends for things to operate by a careful consideration, empirically, of the world around you. Now, we would go on to say, as Paul did, that there's a revelation even beyond that in the life and death and resurrection of Jesus Christ. But we don't thereby deny that there is a basic level of awareness you can have by looking at the world around you carefully. Okay. Let's see. Its effects have been lasting. That's Barth. Do you know the name Barth? B-A-R-T-H. Carl. Oh, dear. I would have thought you. Okay. He is a Swiss Reformed theologian, active shortly during and after the Second World War. There was a time in the Western world, in this country, and on the European continent, if you were a Protestant theologian, you were Barthian. That was true through the 1970s or 80s. My systematics professors in seminary were all Barthians. And on this topic, I got in big trouble, by the way. He did that thing that professors tell you, you don't have to, spit back at me what I've told you. If you have good reasoning and have done some other reading and some thinking, I will evaluate your logic. Well, you won't be surprised to know that I always start with the Bible. And I happened to be in an exegesis course that semester. We were reading Romans in Greek, so I just read Romans 1. And I wrote him this thing about, what I just told you. Barth's argument is that the only revelation that is reliable at all is the revelation that comes to us through Jesus, right? Everything else is man-made religion. He used to say that Christianity is not a religion because religion is man's system of thinking about things, and it's made up, not revealed. Okay. Barth's effects have been long-lasting. beginning with the almost total silence on Israel's wisdom traditions in Gerhard von Rod's magisterial 2-volume Old Testament theology. You don't know that name either, but he was huge in Old Testament studies. He was my grandfather doctor. I studied with his last student. So Bart's concerns were soteriological. That is, what constitutes a saving knowledge of God? My concerns in these lectures lie with the structure of human society, which God has, by implication, had something to say about. Briefly stated, I would like to work backward from Paul's understanding of a universally available nomos. That's the Greek word for law. John's understanding of the divine logos, active in creation, which in turn picks up on the image of the divine chokhmah, wisdom, from Proverbs 8. To Amos's assertion that even those outside the covenant tradition have a concept of what it means to live together. Paul's discussion of nomos in Romans employs the term with at least two connotations. The universally available law that God incorporated into creation, and the specifications of the details of this universal in the revealed Torah. That's the second, those two. Thus, he argues, substituting Torah for nomos when the context seems to require it. And I'm doing my translation of Romans 2:14 next. When Gentiles who do not possess the Torah do instinctively what the Torah requires, then those not having the Torah are a nomos to themselves, a kind of law of their own. When they do instinctively what the Torah requires. In here, if you get interested, I recommend the still very good book by C.S. Lewis. What's it? Mere Christianity. He has a lengthy discussion of just observing the fact that there is no society on earth in which outright murder is okay. So that there is a core universal human conception of nomos, of what is right and wrong, of a law. Now, that's not the same thing as the Torah, although the nomos is consistent with the Torah for the most part. Are you with me? Are you following me? I need to head up and down and sideways. Quit using these foreign language words, something like that. The prologue of John's Gospel employs another vocabulary to make essentially the same assertion, with the exception that John boldly identifies the principle of order designed into creation with the to become incarnate Christ. Here I quote John 1:9-10. The true light that enlightens every man, every human being, was coming into the world. This is pre-incarnate. Before Jesus of Nazareth, the Logos was coming into the world, enlightening everybody. You following me? He was in the world, and the world was made through him. John's assertion, in turn, manifests a clear line of development back to Proverbs 8, the grand celebration of Lady Wisdom, the personification of the principle of order, both physical and moral, which God employed in creation and incorporated into it, and which is available to any who seek her. The book of Amos begins with a series of oracles addressed first to Israel's neighbors. Although Amos does not elaborate a doctrine of natural revelation, these oracles would have no rhetorical force apart from the assumption that every human being and every human society has some understanding of basic morality, an understanding available only through the design of the world, and especially of human beings. The sting of Amos 3 for its Sumerian audience comes from the accusation that although Israel was party to the covenant and knew its Torah, Amos 3, 1-2, the Egyptians and the Assyrians have a better working concept of right and wrong. Can you imagine how that would have felt? Tell an ancient Israelite, the Egyptians and the Assyrians know right and wrong better than you do. Them's fighting words, boy. God created the world to be rich and diverse. God blessed humankind for mutuality, interrelationship, and reciprocity. God granted humankind the freedom and the responsibility for shaping its cultures and forging its history. Human misbehavior perverted and perverts the blessing into a curse. The church and its members can participate in reversing the curse. The church can see what should be and cooperate with God to bring it into being, if only penultimately. Although the church and the state are not and cannot be coterminous, they are not the same thing. Christians can enter into dialogue with a pluralistic culture through a creation blessing discourse. We can do so as beings in the image of God, appealing to other beings in the image of God, making peace, not just longing for it. By acknowledging the image of God in all others, we can work within a cultural and religious plurality to call those others to image God more fully. As seen in the best image of God, the model for humanity, Jesus Christ. The institutional dichotomy between church and state is, in my opinion, necessary. Notice I said the institutional dichotomy. The supposed dichotomy between the spiritual work of the church and political aims is tantamount to a rejection of God's first blessing and original mandate. Whew. I'm tired. What? Do what?
Could you say that again?
Yeah, I'm going to say the whole, that's a sentence with a semicolon in it. I'm going to read the whole sentence. Because the semicolon is meant to contrast, okay? The institutional dichotomy between church and state is necessary. I don't want the church to be the state or the state to be the church, right? The supposed dichotomy between the spiritual work of the church and political aims. Remember, I've defined politics for this paper as the art of living together, how we should live together. The supposed dichotomy between the spiritual work of the church and political aims is tantamount to a rejection of God's first blessing and original mandate. That take care of the world and one another stuff, right? Okay, amen and amen. What questions do you have? That was hard work. By the way, some of you asked to see the text. I think I mentioned this a while ago. I'll go home today or tomorrow and email Drake a PDF of this. As I said, I'll let him know if you want a copy. As I said, I think when I mentioned this to begin with, it's going to be the unadulterated for Baptists version. So just read it with that in mind. Questions or comments? Yes.
I think your topic is just so very timely because with the election in November, I don't hear much about it because there's so many other issues, climate change,
Whoa.
migration and so forth. But we're also going to be voting on this whole issue of Christian nationalism. Do we want the church? Do we want the government? I think that's on the ballot, but maybe kind of hidden. Would that be fair to say?
I don't think it's hidden for people with eyes. The Christian nationalists want it on the ballot. I mean, they know that's what they're voting for. And those of us who aren't afraid of that stuff, who haven't recognized it, need to open our eyes because that is entirely what they're after. And that's why I lament that there are so many Baptists in that movement because it is about as opposite to Baptistness as you can come. But I want to visit what you said about climate change, immigration, all that stuff. All of that falls under this business I've been talking about, hierarchy and reversing the curse and blessing. Because I can't think of anything more relevant in the world we live in to this notion that God gave us the world to take care of, and all we've done is exploit it. We haven't taken care of it. We've robbed it and raped it and ripped it off. And I think that's, that's just Christian, mature Christian understanding has as much to say about that as it does about anything. We've got to do better. Now, how? This is where my students were always, I'd go on a tear about this kind of thing. They'd say, yeah, but Dr. Biddle, what are the specific policies? And I'd always say, well, that's where I'm a theologian. So let's get a environmental scientist who understands those things. I know what we ought to be doing, I think. I don't know how to do it. So let's get somebody who does know how to figure that out. But the objective is, we've got to do better at taking care of this world. It's the only one we got. And rather than using it up, I think, I always operate, or at least have for several years now, with this image in my mind. I don't know that I can ground it biblically or any other way. But I always, if you think about, God gave us, I always think about this. Now, I guess I'm thinking this way again more than I have in a while because of my granddaughter. But when I had children, I was always thinking about, one of my sons came in one day and said, Dad, this horn, he was a trumpet player, this horn's holding me back. I said, well, if it is, son, I'm going to get you one that won't. But I want to first talk with your trumpet teacher and ask if that's in fact what the problem. He withdrew the request. My son did immediately, because he knew if I asked his teacher, is he working as hard as he could, doing what you tell him to? The teacher would say, well, no. And then I would have turned to my son and said, see there, I'll buy you an expensive new horn when this one is really what's holding you back right now. You're what's holding you back. I think of God sitting in his heaven saying, I've given you this one world and you're just messing it up. Why would I give you another? Right? I've given you this one beautiful life and you don't know how to live it with appreciation. Why? So we got to do better. Immigration even. I get really troubled when we. Okay, I'm about to say something, and then I'm going to remind you. I know what the problem is. I know the kind of thing I think we ought to do. The people who write laws are going to have to figure out the laws to make it work. But this notion that there are people who are leaving Honduras or Venezuela because if they stay, they'll get killed by the mob or the government, and they need what do we call it, asylum. My Christian reaction to that is, come to my house. The Christian requirement to love your neighbor applies, I think, to those kind of people. Now, I know there are others. I know there are all kind of reasons people try to get in this country, and not all legitimate and all that kind of stuff. That's, as a Christian, I'm going to vote for somebody. I want to vote for somebody. I'm afraid right now there isn't anybody to vote for. But I want to vote for somebody that recognizes that and is going to come up with real policies to try to fix the problem, right? Which would mean being Christian to people who need help, being fair to everybody, and observing whatever we need to observe about letting people into the country. You can't name an issue on today's political front that I won't approach in some fashion like that. There's some basic principle that derives out of the notion of God's blessing and out of the notion of the Imago Dei and out of the notion that we need to reverse the curse that I can't apply to and will apply, do apply to just about every issue we face today. Now, I know some of you think, but what about, how would you, as I said, I can only study one thing, and what I study is Christian theology, especially biblical. But if I had a PhD in economics, I'd have answers for you. They might not be the right ones, but I'd have some. Yes?
Do you have a thought about the difference between the way you perceive theology,
Right.
out of the supposedly same faith as the Christian nationalists perceive it?
Yeah, I have a. Well, yeah. I'll tell you about that. These kind of people. We've it's been especially rampant in the time frame. We're all within a decade of each other, something like that. In the time frame in which we've come of age, in Baptist life, and this is spread, I'm afraid, I think Presbyterians had a taste of it even a little bit before we did. It's spread as far as even Roman Catholicism now, I think. And this whole business about who believes the Bible more, right? That was what the fight in Baptist life was about. I believe the Bible more than you, right? And I always said to that, well, maybe, but have you read it as much as I have? Way back in the late mid 80s, when I was teaching at Carson Newman in Jefferson City, Tennessee, which is flooded out now, bless their hearts. Anyway, Knoxville's a great big downtown river today. Oh gosh, it's awful. I had a debate, if you will, with a local fundamentalist pastor. And the topic he threw up to me right quick about how I was not doing things biblically was women in ministry. And I don't know if you know that passage in Timothy that they always cite. Do you know it? Are you familiar with it? You ought to go look it up. It's 1 Timothy or 2 Timothy. Now, I read the Bible, I know the Bible. I cannot ever remember where anything is. John 3:16 is about it. It's 1 or 2 Timothy chapter 3. It's where it says, Paul says, I don't permit women to speak in church. You know that passage, you've heard it. If you read the whole context, just a verse or two before, he says, I don't let women wear fancy hairdos, expensive clothes, or jewelry. And I don't let them speak in church. You find one of those right-wingers, and I don't care, they're Presbyterians of this ilk too, who will quote that verse, and especially if it's the pastor of a church, you find his wife in church that Sunday morning. I will guarantee you she's got a really nice hairdo, the nicest dress of any woman in church that Sunday morning, and a good bit of jewelry. So, the Christian nationalists, calling themselves Christian, holding up the Bible that they have never read or understood. If you, I used to tell my students all the time, I would be lecturing about something, and they'd begin to get that defensive posture. That's why I don't like teaching online, by the way. When I'm teaching online, I can't see if you're taking what I'm saying well, with a good disposition, understanding it, or whether you're getting defensive or misunderstanding it and that kind of thing. In class, you can tell. And whenever I see that, that kind of thing, I always stop and say, now look, here, I'm going to read this to you. I read it from the Bible. And I say, if you don't like that, I'm sorry. I did not write this. I'm just reading it to you. And what I want to say to the Christian nationalists is, come sit with me for an hour or so with an open mind. I won't try to browbeat you, but I am going to read you some stuff that you probably have never read. And let's see what you think then. There was a meme, I hope it wasn't true, but about 2 or 3 months ago there was a meme running around. Some pastor somewhere had preached a sermon on the series on the Sermon on the Mount. And the leadership of his church had told him not to do that again. That he said, but that's what Jesus said. And they said, it's outdated. It won't work in today's world. I hope that wasn't true. But I bet it was. So that's been my life work. If you say you love the Bible, do me a favor and read it. And when you've read it, we'll talk about it. Or I'll talk about it with you while you read it. That's fine too. But number one is not how much, but whether you're familiar with it. And we discovered that the Christian nationalists don't really like the Bible that much when they get into reading it. They want it to be edited, right? It's not practicable today. When has love your neighbor been practical? Love your enemy, Jesus went on to say. When has that been practical? Is it about being practical? Other question, comment? Oh, come on. Either I've just been that bad or that good, and I don't believe either one of those.
I find it hard to we're sitting here and we're defining candidates, Christian, national, or not. I don't see any candidates in that mix, and maybe not nine.
Well, I mean, okay, I don't think that Donald Trump is a Christian nationalist. He will use them and do some of the things they want done to keep them happy. So that, to my mind, is, he may not. I don't think he's Christian of any kind. 2 Corinthians, what's your favorite Bible verse? Well, I have one. I promise you. You all need one of my Bibles in your house because the Bible's a really good book. I have a lot of Bibles. That's almost a direct quote. I don't think he's ever held one. Well, yeah, I know he held one time, upside down, out in front of the National Monument when he wanted to have the protesters shot. Yeah, that's twice. He holds a Bible in his hand during that commercial where he's selling them. But he's a prime example. I never read a word of it, I bet you. But that won't keep him from, doing what they want done to get their vote. Yes?
On that subject, I remember reading in the Washington Post, they tried to find out what Bible he actually was using when he marched across the square to get his photo op. It turned out it was Vanna Trump's Bible. She kept it in her purse, and of course she walked with him.
Yeah.
So I don't know if he knew
that she kept it Bible.
But in any case, it was pure photo op.
Yeah. Well, I want to remind us, I said at the beginning that this whole discussion was not about partisan politics, and I kind of don't want to get into that. Although, I think if you've heard me, you know the tenor of how I view certain things. Now, I will add, I don't think that Kamala Harris is, Matthew, the gospel writer, or anything like that. But I would say that the kind of thing I think needs to be done, at least right now, it seems she's more willing to do it. I don't think she's going to do it. I don't think anybody's ready to do the right thing on immigration because it's going to be hard and difficult and complicated. And in order to do it, you'd have to convince the American populace that they could pay attention long enough to understand something that was long, complicated, and hard. Our attention span, or yes or no. Are you going to make it better? Yes. Okay. I don't want to know how you're going to do it. Just do it. And that's not going to work.
Mark, this is where I have a belief that, and it may be wrong, but I have a belief this is where the church has failed.
Oh.
The church relies too much on government to resolve the problems of humankind. And I've always believed that our church, universal, should be working together to resolve the problems as opposed to pushing it across the...
Well, maybe I didn't emphasize this enough. It's in there several points where I reminded us that government is not the only politics. I think the work of an organization like Habitat for Humanity, you can go on for a long time. They are about politics understood as living together the way God would want us to, right? They're very political organizations. If they're not partisan, that's okay, but they're very political. You may not remember, I came of age in a time when, at least in the South, I don't know how it was outside of the South, but and this didn't matter what denomination you were. In the South, there was this notion among Christians that there were just certain things that were the work of government and certain things that are the work of the church. I alluded to this. The church is about getting people saved, if you will, or spiritual matters, right? Let the secular society take care of all those other things. And I think that's 100% abdication of what God intends. If you're talking about a hungry, think of Jesus. Here again, for heaven's sakes, don't try to emulate Jesus, whatever you do. Because if you do, you're going to be concerned about those who needed something to drink and something to eat, those who were in prison, right? The Samaritans by the side of the road, all of those kinds of things. And the church I grew up in said, oh, no. We're just about, evangelism. Presbyterians in that day were the same way, and so were Methodists, and so was pretty much everybody else, in the South anyway. That was an abdication of what God, an abdication of God's call. The very first one, take care of the earth. Drake has given us a time up. So join me in a word of prayer. Lord, partisan politics aside, help each and every one of us to determine that in our efforts to live in this world that you've given us, to take care of it, to order and structure it, and to live alongside our fellow human beings in all their diversity, all of which reflects your glory. Help us to determine to try to be the kind of politicians Jesus was. Asking first and foremost, what should be done in the name of God? We ask this in Jesus' name. Amen.